Mississippi, 1923. A land where the soil was rich, the air was thick, and every shadow carried a warning. In the Delta, the sun rose slow and heavy over cotton fields that whispered of centuries-old sorrow, and the river moved like a dark ribbon stitching together towns that lived by silence and fear. It was here, in Sunflower County, that Sarah Whitfield, a black widow with 2 young children, stood against an unspoken law that demanded her obedience and her erasure. The year had already taken her husband Elijah, stolen by a lie disguised as an accident, and now the world around her shifted with a dangerous stillness. Every day she walked the red dirt roads with dignity, but at night the wind carried sounds that made her tighten her grip on the shotgun Elijah left behind. Sarah was not a heroine by choice. She was a woman trying to survive in a place where survival itself was rebellion. Her cabin stood at the edge of a cotton field that bore the marks of her labor, her grief, and her stubborn hope. The white men who passed her gate knew she refused to bow, and that refusal made her a marked woman. Yet beneath her fear lived something stronger, a quiet fire, the kind that grows in the heart of a mother determined to protect her children against a world that had twisted itself around hate. Sarah's story, long buried in whispers and unmarked graves, is one of those truths America tried to forget. This is the beginning of her night of reckoning, one of countless forgotten lynching attempts, buried beneath silence and shame. Tonight, we remember her not as a victim, but as a mother who stood between death and the ones she loved, and in doing so, carved her name into the unspoken history of resistance. The night began with a hush that felt unnatural, as though the land itself knew what was coming. A pale harvest moon hung low over the Delta fields, casting long silver shadows across the yard where Sarah Whitfield hung her laundry earlier that day. The air was still, too still, holding its breath the way a church congregation does when the preacher pauses before delivering a hard truth. Inside the small cabin, Sarah sat by the table with a needle in hand, mending Daniel's shirt while her children drifted towards sleep. The lamplight flickered softly, painting her face in warm gold and gentle exhaustion. But underneath the domestic quiet, a tension pulsed. The memory of Elijah's death, the warnings from neighbors, the feeling that danger had not left with the last sunset. Then came the distant hum of tires rolling across gravel. Slow, deliberate, wrong for this hour and this road. Sarah froze, the needle caught between her fingers. Her heart began to thud against her ribs as she lifted her head, listening with the practiced instinct of a woman who had learned the rhythm of approaching danger. The sound grew louder, then eased into a crawl. Headlights swept past the window, 2 pale beams dragging long shadows across the floor before settling outside the fence. She snuffed out the lamp in a single breath, darkness washing over the room like a veil. Only the faint glow of the dying fire remained, crackling softly beneath the heavy silence. Through a slit in the curtain she saw it, a black Model T idling like a predator crouching in tall grass. 3 figures inside, unmoving, faces swallowed by the dark. They did not call out. They did not signal. They simply waited, letting fear do the talking. Sarah could feel the cold rise in her chest, but she forced her breath steady. She reached for the shotgun, leaning near the door, the wood familiar beneath her palm. Behind her, Ruth and Daniel stirred in their sleep, unaware of the storm gathering at their doorstep. Sarah whispered a prayer, not for deliverance, but for strength. She knew what night it was, a night when the world decided whether a black woman lived or died. The engine went silent, leaving a void so complete it felt like the night itself had stopped breathing. Sarah remained at the window, her fingers tightening around the curtain as the pale moon traced the outline of the parked car. The stillness outside was suffocating, a kind of quiet that hunted. Then, with slow deliberation, the driver's door creaked open. A boot hit the ground, crisp against the gravel, followed by the flare of a match that briefly illuminated a hard, pale face. A man, whose expression carried the same casual cruelty she'd seen in the fields and the general store. Smoke curled upward from his cigarette, drifting lazily through the moonlight as though the world were not on the edge of violence. Two more men remained seated inside the car, their silhouettes motionless and heavy with intent. They did not rush. They did not hide. They simply watched her home with a kind of confident hunger, knowing the darkness itself served them. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and hissed, its small sounds too loud in the oppressive quiet. Sarah slowly stepped back from the window, her lungs tightening with the weight of what she knew was coming. Fear pulsed beneath her skin, not wild, but steady, the kind that sharpens the senses rather than scatters them. She could feel every grain of the wooden floor beneath her bare feet, every trembling breath her children took in their sleep. The house was small, too small to hide in, but it was hers. She moved through its shadows with soft precision, lifting the shotgun from its resting place behind the kitchen door. The metal felt heavier tonight, not because she wasn't strong enough to hold it, but because she understood exactly what it meant to raise it. Her thoughts flickered to Elijah, to the bruises that spoke louder than the sheriff's lies, and to the last night she had seen him alive. The memory hardened her grip. The man outside exhaled a long ribbon of smoke, then said something to the others inside the car, too soft to decipher, but cruel enough to twist the night into something colder. Laughter followed, low and certain, the kind that stripped a person of their humanity simply by existing. Sarah's pulse quickened as she crouched near the children, brushing a hand over their foreheads, whispering the words Elijah had made her practice. "If I say run, you run to the trees and don't look back." Ruth stirred, her small fingers clinging to her mother's wrist even in sleep. Sarah gently untangled herself, swallowing the knot rising in her throat. She stood slowly, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of embers behind her, and moved toward the door, where the first hint of danger lingered like a shadow, reaching under the frame. Outside, gravel shifted under approaching boots, each step measured, confident, and merciless. The night had come for her, and she had no choice now but to meet it standing. The first knock came soft, and false, wrapped in a politeness meant only to mock. It tapped gently against the thin wooden door, like the beginning of a neighborly visit, but its echo crawled across the walls and into Sarah's bones. She held her breath, listening as the knock came again, harder this time, shaking dust from the rafters. "Evening, Miss Whitfield," a voice drawled from the porch, smooth as river mud. "We just came by to talk." She knew that voice. Everyone in Sunflower County did. Harlan Brewer, a man whose hands had never touched a plow, but were stained with the kind of cruelty born from power inherited rather than earned. His words seeped through the cracks, each syllable a reminder of what Elijah had whispered about him late at night, that the devil didn't always wear horns. Sometimes he wore a hat and smiled while he lied. Sarah pressed her forehead against the door, steadying her breath as the wood trembled under the next heavy blow. Behind her, Ruth whimpered in her sleep, the sound thin and frightened. Sarah turned, her heart twisting as she saw her daughter's small hands clutching the quilt. She crossed the room in 3 quiet steps, kneeling beside her children with a tenderness that felt like prayer. "Mama, who is it?" Ruth whispered, eyes wide in the dim flicker of the dying fire. Sarah touched a finger gently to her lips. "Hush now." Her voice was soft, but edged with urgency. Outside, the footsteps multiplied, boots shifting, boards creaking, the subtle scrape of metal against wood as one of the men dragged something behind him. She smelled the kerosene before she saw the shadows on the curtains, long and jagged like claws. Her stomach dropped. Kerosene meant fire. Fire meant death. The door shook again beneath a brutal kick, and she felt the decision before she spoke it aloud. This night was no longer about fear. It was about survival. She rose to her feet with a slowness that came from resolve rather than hesitation. The shotgun felt like an extension of her arm, its wooden stock worn smooth by Elijah's hands and now warmed by her own. She stepped back toward the door, placing herself between danger and the 2 small lives behind her. "Ain't no need for this door between us," Harlan Brewer called, knocking once more as though making a polite suggestion. She closed her eyes for a moment. letting the heat of the firelight rest on her skin. Then she opened them again, her voice low and steady, carrying the bitterness of a truth long forced into silence. "You come through this door," she said, "and you'll meet the Lord before morning." For a heartbeat the porch went still, stunned by the courage of a woman they believed fear should have broken. Then came laughter, harsh and hollow, followed by a voice dripping with hate. "You think you can stop us, gal?" Sarah said nothing. Her silence was answer enough, and outside, the men prepared to prove they feared nothing. Inside, Sarah prepared to show them they were wrong. The next blow was not a knock, but an assault, a violent kick that cracked the lower panel of the door and sent splinters skittering across the floor. The cabin shuddered under the impact, its frail bones groaning like an old man, forced to stand once more. Sarah stepped back, her breath tightening as dust drifted from the rafters and settled in the dim flicker of the fire. Outside, the men murmured to one another, their voices low and eager, the tones of hunters, certain their prey had nowhere left to run. She moved swiftly to the hearth, her fingers trembling as she pulled the children's mattress aside and revealed the trap door Elijah had built in secret years ago. Ruth and Daniel stared up at her with confused, frightened eyes. "Get in," she whispered. "Now!" Daniel hesitated, clutching his sister's hand as the door shook beneath another vicious kick. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but Sarah pressed her hand to his cheek, her voice breaking only once as she said, "Please." That single word carried every fear she'd swallowed, every night she'd waited for danger to arrive, and every shred of love she had left to give. The children slipped into the hollow space, just as the upper hinge gave a tortured cry. Sarah pulled the rug back across the opening, smoothing it with shaking hands, even as the men outside cursed, their boots scuffing against the porch boards. The smell of kerosene thickened in the air, seeping through the cracks like a warning from hell itself. She felt her heartbeat shift, no longer the sharp quickness of panic, but the heavy, steady rhythm of someone preparing for what could not be avoided. Harlan Brewer's voice rose above the others, stripped now of its false civility and dripping with venom. "You had your chance," he bellowed. "Ain't no one coming to save you, woman. You should have left when your husband did." The cruelty of the words struck her like a physical blow. For a moment she closed her eyes, seeing Elijah's face in the glow of the fire, gentle, tired, loving. Then she inhaled, letting the memory harden into something sharp. She rose slowly, the shotgun heavy and resolute in her grip. The porch creaked beneath approaching steps. A sudden thud struck the side of the cabin, then another, until the unmistakable whoosh of flame blossomed along the wall, its orange glow sliding through the cracks like a serpent of light. Heat pressed against the door, and smoke slithered inward, curling around Sarah's ankles. She backed away, lifting the gun and bracing it against her shoulder. Her breath became deliberate, quiet, each inhale tasting of smoke and determination. Outside, the flames crackled eagerly as the men prepared to burst through the doorway. Sarah felt her fear melt away, replaced by a fierce clarity born not from bravery, but from love. Cornered. "Not my home," she whispered to the fire, to the men, to the memory of Elijah. "Not my babies." The door gave one final groan, and then exploded inward. The door burst inward with a roar of splintering wood, fragments scattering across the floor like shrapnel as smoke rushed in behind them. The first man stepped through the wreckage with a torch raised high, its flames licking at the low ceiling as though hungry for breath. His hood cast a pointed shadow across the floorboards, turning him into a silhouette of hatred rather than flesh. Sarah did not hesitate. Her finger tightened around the trigger, and the shotgun thundered through the cabin, its sound so deafening it swallowed the crackle of flames and the shouts on the porch. The man staggered, his torch tumbling from his hand and rolling across the floor, spreading fire across the curtains in a frenzy of sparks. He collapsed at her feet, the hood falling back to reveal a face twisted not by agony, but by shock, the shock of a man who never believed a black woman would dare pull the trigger. Smoke thickened instantly, swirling in hot grey clouds that clawed at her lungs. Her ears rang from the blast, yet she forced herself to reload, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the urgency of survival. Outside, she heard confusion, the frantic scuffling of boots, the desperate shouts of men who had expected a victim but found a defender instead. She shot him! God Almighty, she shot him! Their voices rose sharp and panicked, the certainty of their power slipping into disbelief. Through the haze, a shadow darted past the window, and Sarah lifted the gun again, firing into the blur of movement. A scream tore through the night, echoing off the burning porch. The balance of terror had shifted. For the first time, they sounded afraid. But the fire was claiming the house faster than the men ever could. Flames raced up the walls, consuming Elijah's wooden beams with a ferocity that made the structure groan under its own weight. Heat pressed against Sarah's skin, blistering and relentless, forcing her backward as smoke filled her eyes with tears she didn't have the breath to shed. She could barely see the front of the room anymore, just the orange glow of fire devouring everything she had built. Her thoughts snapped to the trapdoor, to the small bodies hidden beneath the floorboards. "Lord!" she rasped, choking on the smoke. "Don't let this fire take them." She pressed the back of her hand against her burning throat and staggered toward the kitchen, shielding her face as another beam cracked overhead and fell in a shower of sparks. The men outside had fled, but inside, the flames were closing in. The battle was no longer against hatred, it was against the fire itself. The heat pressed against her like a living thing, clawing at her skin as she forced her way toward the back of the cabin. Flames licked across the walls Elijah had built board by board, each crack and groan of the timber, sounding like a cry she could feel in her chest. Smoke curled through the air in thick, choking waves, turning every breath into a battle. Sarah's vision blurred as she stumbled toward the trapdoor, her lungs tightening with each inhale of burning air. The floorboards beneath her feet were scorching, shifting under her weight, as if ready to collapse at any moment. She dropped to her knees, coughing so violently she saw stars, and clawed at the edge of the rug. "Babies!" she rasped, her voice shredded. For a terrifying second there was nothing but the roar of fire. Then Daniel's small hand pushed up from the darkness, fingers trembling, reaching for her like a lifeline. She pulled Daniel up first, his face smeared with ash, tears carving narrow rivers down his cheeks. Ruth followed, her tiny chest heaving as she gulped the smoky air, coughing into Sarah's shoulder. The children clung to her with desperate, trembling arms, their bodies warm and shaking beneath the blanket of soot. "Mama, the fire!" Ruth cried, her voice raw with terror. Sarah pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, pushing their hair back from their eyes with trembling hands. "Don't look at it," she whispered. "Look at me." She wrapped the blanket from their bedding around them both, shielding their faces as sparks rained down from the collapsing rafters. The cabin that had held their prayers, their grief, their nights of whispered fear, was turning into a furnace around them. There was no time left. The way out was already shrinking beneath falling beams and dancing flames. With one arm around each child, Sarah rose, staggering toward the back door as chunks of burning ceiling crashed to the floor behind her. Heat seared her skin, turning every step into agony, yet she did not slow. She could feel the fire chasing them, reaching for their heels as though determined to finish what the men outside had begun. The back door was warped and glowing, its metal latch scorching hot, but she threw her shoulder against it with a cry, forcing it open to the cool night air. They tumbled into the yard, collapsing onto the dirt as the fire roared behind them, lighting the night sky in furious orange. Outside, the world smelled of smoke and damp soil, the air blessedly breathable compared to the inferno inside. Sarah gathered the children close, pressing their faces into the crook of her neck as the cabin behind them groaned once more, then collapsed in a thunder of sparks and falling timber. She watched it burn, tears carving clean lines down her soot-darkened face. They had lost everything made of wood and nail, but the most precious things, her children, her faith, her will, had survived the fire. Dawn crept slowly over the ruined homestead, its pale light sliding across the smouldering embers that once formed walls, windows, a roof, a life. Thin wisps of smoke rose into the grey morning, twisting like unsettled spirits. Above the ash, Sarah sat beneath the old pecan tree, with Ruth and Daniel curled against her sides, their breaths soft and shallow in the quiet that followed catastrophe. Her hands were blistered, her throat raw, her dress torn and streaked with soot, yet her back remained straight, her gaze fixed on the ruins, as if willing them to confess some final truth. The charred heap crackled softly, wood cooling in the early dew, and in that stillness she felt an ache that ran deeper than loss. An ache carved by the knowledge that the world around her had hoped this fire would finish what Elijah's murder had begun. But the sunrise warmed her shoulders, and she realized something unexpected. She was not defeated. She had lived through the night the world wanted her dead. The quiet was broken by the soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt road. Sarah tensed, her arms tightening protectively around the children. For a breathless moment, her mind returned to the sound of boots on the porch, to firelight against the curtains, to hatred whispered outside her door. But this time, it was Martha Lewis, grey-haired, broad-shouldered, carrying a bucket of clean water and a face streaked with grief. "Oh, Sarah," she murmured, her voice cracking as she knelt beside her friend. Her eyes swept over the ruined home, the exhausted children, the burns on Sarah's hands. "Lord, have mercy." She took Sarah's blistered fingers gently into her own, her touch trembling as though she feared they might break. "They did this?" she asked, though the answer was written everywhere, in the ashes, in the children's soot-darkened hair, in the hollowness of the morning. Sarah nodded once, her jaw tight. "They came for us," she whispered, "but they didn't take us." Martha's eyes glistened as she stared into the fierce steadiness of Sarah's gaze. "You fought back," she breathed. "Didn't you?" Sarah did not look away. "I did what I had to." By midday, others arrived. Men, women, elders, children, drawn by rumors of gunfire that traveled faster than dawn's first light. They came quietly, glancing over their shoulders, carrying bread, blankets, hammers, nails, and the unspoken knowledge that standing here placed them in danger too. They formed a half-circle around the ruins, their faces carved with shock, sorrow, and something else rising beneath both, a stirring like embers catching breath. No one spoke at first. They simply began to work. Planks were lifted, nails hammered, water thrown across stubborn pockets of flame. As ashes rose into the warming air, they mixed with the scent of soil and sweat, turning grief into movement. Sarah watched, overwhelmed by the sight of a community gathered not to mourn her defeat, but to resurrect her dignity. Beneath the pecan tree, she pulled her children close and whispered a promise meant for the earth itself. "We're not running, not ever again." By the second day, the story had already stretched beyond the edges of Sunflower County, carried in hushed tones through cotton rows, over church pews, and along the dusty roads where wagon wheels carved slow, deliberate paths. "That colored widow shot the Klan," some whispered. "They say she killed too." Others swore they'd seen bodies taken away under the cover of darkness, faces hidden, shameful in their stillness. The truth grew its own spine, its own heartbeat, its own strength, and suddenly the Delta was alive with a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that made oppressed people stand a little straighter and their oppressors grind their teeth. Sarah felt it in the air, a tension humming through every step she took. She was no longer just a mother who survived a fire. She had become something else, something the white men in power could neither control nor erase. Her name had turned into a spark drifting across dry leaves, threatening to ignite a forest. Late that afternoon, a cloud of dust rose on the horizon. The sheriff rode in with 2 deputies, their horses moving with deliberate slowness, as though each step was meant to remind the world who claimed authority here. The sheriff dismounted at the edge of the property, his eyes cold and sharp as cut glass. He stared at the ashes of the cabin, at the half-built frame of the new one rising under neighbors' hands, at the small girl clinging to her mother's dress. The silence stretched until it felt like the sky itself was holding It's breath. There's been talk, he said finally, his voice curling with accusation, that you shot 2 white men last night. The words slithered through the crowd. Sarah stood tall, her face a mask of exhaustion and resolve, her blistered hands folded before her. Men came to my door, she said quietly. They brought fire and death. I sent it back. Murmurs rippled through the neighbors, strength passing between them like a current. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dirt. You best be careful how you speak, woman, he hissed, as though the air itself belonged to him. The law don't protect folks who think they're above it. Sarah lifted her chin, the wind catching the loose strands of her soot-darkened hair. And who protects us? She asked, her voice steady as iron. When the law wears the same boots as the men who burn our homes. The deputies stiffened, their hands drifting toward their belts, but the sheriff faltered for half a second, just long enough for the truth to sink into him like a thorn he couldn't pull free. Behind Sarah, neighbors closed ranks, men and women standing shoulder to shoulder in a quiet show of unity. Their presence was not loud, not threatening, but it was unwavering, and the sheriff felt it. He spat in the dirt, not in victory but in frustration. I'll be watching you, Mrs. Whitfield, he muttered. Then he turned his horse and rode away, the dust rising behind him like a retreating storm cloud. When he was gone, Sarah exhaled slowly, her children leaning into her sides, and the people around her nodded with a solemn, unspoken understanding. This fire had not ended anything. It had begun something. The nights after the sheriff's visit grew heavier than the smoke that once clung to the ruins of Sarah's home. Evening settled over Sunflower County with a tension that seemed to follow her everywhere, a watchful quiet, a silence that listened. Each sunset carried the memory of fire, and each creak of the floorboards made her pulse rise, not with fear but with readiness. In the cramped shack Martha had offered her, Sarah sat by the single window each night, Elijah's shotgun resting across her knees like a sleeping sentinel. Ruth and Daniel lay bundled on the floor behind her, their soft breaths a fragile reminder of what she had fought for. Though exhaustion tugged at her bones, sleep would not come. Courage, she'd learned, did not erase fear. It simply lived beside it, stiff-backed and unyielding, and Sarah had become courage itself, tired, blistered, scarred, but immovable. Across the county, whispers flowed like a rising river. At the church 2 towns over, a deacon brought hushed warnings. The Klan was meeting again, angrier now, humiliated, desperate to reclaim the fear she had ripped from them. Their dead, however many they were, had faces and families, and those families demanded vengeance. They say they come in again, the deacon told her, his hat twisting between his fearful hands. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Sarah listened in silence, the lamplight catching the hardened lines of her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, shaped by nights of fire and grief. Then let them come, she said. There's nothing left they can burn that matters. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't bravado. It was truth spoken by a woman who had already walked through death's shadow and no longer trembled at its shape. Still, she planned. She taught Ruth how to move quietly through the woods, how to follow the river if they ever needed to run. She showed Daniel where the shells were kept and how to tuck Elijah's Bible inside his shirt. It was a cruel education, born not from choice, but from necessity. Meanwhile, the community moved like a single, determined body. Neighbors came every morning, some with tools, some with food, some with nothing but their presence. Together, they rebuilt a new cabin on the very soil meant to be her grave. Each plank they raised was a testament. Each hammer strike was a vow. They want to see fear when they look this way, Martha murmured, patting Sarah's arm as they worked side by side. Let 'em see us build instead. Beneath the afternoon sun, the new home took shape. Smaller, sturdier, thicker walls, iron nails, no weak hinges. But even as the walls rose, every person there felt the truth pressing at the edges of the air. The men who had come in the night would return. They could not abide defiance. They could not stomach a woman, a black woman, standing unbroken where they meant her to kneel. That night, as stars pricked the sky above Sunflower County, Sarah stepped outside the nearly finished cabin, her children asleep inside. She stared down the long dirt road where hatred had once arrived in a Model T and whispered into the dark, "You know where I live. Come and see what God left standing." Just before midnight, the world shifted, a faint tremor in the air, a subtle change in the wind, and then the unmistakable sound Sarah had trained herself to recognize. Hooves, slow, deliberate, measured like a heartbeat, edging toward death. The horses moved down the dirt road with a grim purpose, their footfalls muffled by the thick delta mist rising from the fields. Sarah's eyes snapped open where she sat by the window, her hand already closing around the shotgun before her mind caught up. The children slept on the floor nearby, wrapped in Martha's quilt, their breaths soft, unaware. A chill moved through the cabin, one that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The mist danced outside the window, curling around the fence posts like ghostly fingers reaching forward. She moved to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain with slow precision, letting only the smallest sliver of moonlight through. And there they were, 6 riders this time, white robes ghosting through the fog, their pointed hoods pale against the dark. They carried no torches tonight. They had learned from the flames that turned against them. Their robes swayed in the mist like unnatural shapes, their horses breathing clouds into the cold air. There was no pretense of civility now, no knocks, no poisoned smiles, no empty words, only death riding quiet and sure. Beneath their robes, she caught the gleam of rifles strapped to saddles. These men were prepared to erase her, but she had. Prepared too. Behind the cabin, a shallow trench she'd dug lay hidden beneath brush, soaked with oil for this very moment. Tonight, it was not fear that guided her. It was strategy, sharpened by survival. The riders stopped at the gate, their horses stamping quietly in the mud. One man dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. His voice sliced through the fog, harsh and brittle. "Sarah Whitfield," he called, "you made your point. Now come out and pay the price." His tone carried the hollow authority of someone trying to imitate a cruelty he'd inherited but not earned. Sarah did not answer. The man took another step forward, voice rising. "You think you're a hero? You're nothing. A stain we came to wipe clean." The others laughed, a low, vicious sound that bled into the night. Sarah looked down at her children, sleeping beside each other like 2 small lanterns of innocence. She whispered a prayer she had never prayed before, a raw plea pulled straight from the marrow of her soul. "If you can't stop them, Lord, guide my hands." And in the space between fear and faith, she rose. She took the oil lantern from the table, lifted it high, and with the practiced precision of a woman who had imagined this moment 1,000 times, she hurled it through the window. The glass shattered at the rider's feet, and a serpent of flame burst across the wet grass, rising in an instant as fire licked their boots and startled their horses. Chaos erupted. Men cursed, stumbling back as the fire spread faster than they could react. Sarah leveled the shotgun, braced her feet and fired. The night tore open. A rider fell. Another stumbled away from the blaze. The ponies reared, eyes wild with terror. The air filled with firelight and smoke, with shouts and confusion, and the stunned disbelief of men who discovered the prey they hunted had become something else entirely, a force of will that refused to disappear quietly into Mississippi's night. When the last hoofbeats scattered into the trees, a heavy stillness settled over the yard, the kind that follows lightning when the world pauses to remember its own fragility. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, her silhouette cut sharp against the flickering wall of flame she had summoned to protect her children. Smoke curled around her like a dark veil, rising from the scorched earth where the riders had fled. Her breath came in harsh, ragged pulls. Her chest, burning from the gun's recoil and the thick air she'd been breathing since the fire first bloomed across the grass. Yet she did not lower the shotgun. Not at first. She kept it raised, her gaze sweeping the tree line for any sign of movement, her heart still tethered to the rhythm of survival. Only when the night settled, not in peace but in retreat, did she finally let the barrel drop, the weight of steel pulling her arm down as though reminding her she was still flesh, still mortal, still fighting